Today, I've got 5 tips for handheld landscape photography. So regular viewers of the channel will know that I tend to shoot with a tripod. Most often when I'm out, I'm either photographing waterfalls or I'm out at sunrise, sunset, where I'm trying to do those longer exposures where the shutter speeds are open longer and I just can't handhold and keep it steady. So I like to use a tripod. I also like to use a tripod because a lot of times, as long as I approach it carefully, it can make me a little more deliberate with my scene, because I can think about my composition and think about where I want to place the tripod, where I want to set the tripod, and it just sort of helps slow me down a little bit. Now, with that said, you can always fall into the trap of getting your tripod set up too early, and then you're reluctant to move. So you got to be careful of that with a tripod, but overall, I prefer my landscape photography with a tripod. But there are times that photographing handheld is important. For example, if you're trying to travel light and quickly without a whole bunch of weight or anything like that, sometimes leaving the tripod behind is the best way to go. If you're doing a lot of long distance hiking or a lot of scrambles or anything like that, or even sometimes it's a case where I'll leave my tripod up a hill and then make a steep scurry down or up to a location and only take my camera with no tripod. Again, handy for those times that you're trying to keep the load light or you're trying to keep your flexibility of your hiking adaptable, easy to handle the climbs, the ups and downs and everything like that. So there's a case where you might want to leave the tripod behind and only use your camera handheld. Additionally, sometimes when you go to a feature-rich area, when you're trying to scout out a composition, work through multiple compositions and the light's moving fast, while the tripod is handy because it sort of makes you be deliberate and be conscious, it takes time to set that tripod up and get it set to the right level, get it balanced, get it straight, get your composition on top. And the light may be moving really fast with a myriad, especially if you're up on like a ridge line or something like that. You may have some subject off in this distance and off in this direction and off on this direction. And the tripod's just really going to slow you down, that you're going to start missing shots. And when things and conditions are moving fast and those pops of light are happening different places as the clouds move over or the lights, fading, being able to shoot handheld is pretty helpful in those situations, because when you're handheld, you can just pick up your camera, go, move, and very quickly see what's happening around you and react to the light as it moves. And with the tripod, I feel like you're a little less reactionary and you're a little more like, I'm going to get this shot. So that's another case where shooting handheld can be an advantage and worthwhile to do when you're out practicing your landscape photography. And then finally, a lot of times on my bigger trips, I will carry 2 camera bodies into the field. I'll take my main camera, my Z7 II, and this will be the one that goes up on a tripod. And it's going to sort of keep an eye out on the grand scene. So like if I'm at Lindy Point in West Virginia, for example, I will compose my shot and I'll get the sunset out there in the distance. I'll get the light coming across the valley. And I'm just sort of waiting for something cool to happen. But I'll get my camera on the tripod, get it all lined up, all set, and it's going to just sort of sit there. Well, if I only have that one camera, I'm sort of stuck. I sort of have to just let that camera sit and wait, and I'm missing out everything else that's happening all around me. So I typically, in a lot of situations, carry a second camera body, the Z6 II. And with that camera, I can put a different lens on it, and I can sort of keep an eye out on those situations, and I can shoot handheld. I can look for the light hitting a ridge. I can look for how it's hitting a tree down below. I can look for just how the light's moving around, or I can use something like a long lens, like a 100 to 400, and while I might have a wide lens on the one on the tripod, I can do some smaller scene shots with the 100 to 400 handheld. So another case where being able to confidently shoot handheld can help your landscape photography, even if you predominantly like to shoot from a tripod. And because I think that's important for you to know how to shoot handheld, I've got 5 tips today on how you can shoot more confidently handheld and still get nice, sharp images for your landscape photography portfolio. So let's take the camera and no tripod. We're going to head down the trail a little bit and we're going to cover my 5 tips. So the first tip for handheld landscape photography is keep your shutter speed up. When you're hand holding it, your camera can shake, it can move, and because of that, you need your shutter speed to be fast enough to freeze that motion. When you're in the tripod, it gets to sit right there on the tripod, nice, stable, gives you that stable platform. But when you're hand holding it, when you're up here, you could, like I said, you could be moving it or anything like that. You just don't have that stable base to work from. So you want to keep your shutter speed up. This is one of the things I see a lot of people make a mistake on, is they let that shutter speed drop too low, and then they wonder why their images are just a touch soft. And it's because you're probably making a little bit of movement. So how fast do you want that shutter speed? So the rule of thumb is 1 times your focal length up to 2 times your focal length. And I think this varies depending on focal length and depending on how steady you feel you are as a landscape photographer. So for example, say you're shooting at 30 millimeters. 1 times your focal length for shutter speed would mean you're going to shoot at 1/30th of a second or faster. If you were doing 1.5, that would be 1/45th, which means 140 is too slow, means you'd want 1/50th of a second or faster. And if you're shooting 2 times your focal length and you were shooting 30 millimeters, you'd want a 1/60th or faster shutter speed. Now, as you start to move up, I find I want to be closer to that 2 times. So say I'm photographing at 200 millimeters. Well, when you're zoomed in and shooting, your camera movements are more exaggerated because you're really zoomed in there and you can see that camera shake a little more. So in those cases, if I'm starting to use a telephoto, I really want to be 2 times my focal length. So when I start broaching really anything much over 100, I like to start doubling my focal length. So 1/200th of a second if I'm shooting 100 millimeters. If I'm shooting 200 millimeters, I'm trying to get up around 1/400th of a second shutter speed, and so on. Now, different people have a different level of stability. I drink a lot of coffee, so I know 1 times is typically just a little too slow for me, and I tend to be at least 1.5 and often up to 2 times if I think I can get it and maintain some image quality with it. My recommendation is take your favorite lens, head out into the backyard and just play. Do a focal length. It doesn't have to be a pretty picture. What you're trying to do is see where you can handhold to and shoot some at 1 times your focal length, some at 1.5, and some at 2 times your focal length. Then head inside, pull them on your computer and see where you're at. And you'll sort of get a rule of thumb where you should be at. Wider focal lengths, you might be able to handhold 1 times. You might even be able to go under if you're super stable. If you're using a telephoto, you might find you're fine at 1.5, or get 2 times. You just got to sort of figure out where you are with that. Those are really just guidelines just to see where you stand amongst those guidelines. So I highly recommend trying to practice that at home rather than when you're out on some great landscape photography trip and then being uncomfortable, not knowing quite what you can handhold to. So end point being, shutter speed is important when you're doing handheld because you want to minimize camera shake. Camera shake can vary. If you're on the wider side, you won't see the camera shake quite as much. As you start to zoom in, you start to see the camera shake more. So you need to adjust that shutter speed a little faster, even according to the guidelines. So shutter speed is important. Keep that in mind when you're doing handheld landscape photography. So tip number 2 is you're going to need to increase your ISO. In order to hit those faster shutter speeds, something has to change in the exposure triangle. It's so ingrained in us landscape photographers to shoot at your base ISO, ISO 100, ISO 64, ISO 200. And when we're on a tripod, we can do that because we have a nice stable platform, we can lower our shutter speed and we're fine. But when you start hand-holding, like we talked in tip number 1, you're going to need a faster shutter speed to avoid camera shake. Most often the way there is going to be raise your ISO up. It's going to amplify the light hitting the sensor, letting you have those faster shutter speeds. So don't be afraid to raise your ISO. A lot of times when I'm doing handheld photography, I'm defaulting to ISO 400 just right out of the gate. That's a nice solid ISO for the Nikon cameras. Works really well. Gets me slightly faster shutter speed, letting me handhold. So a lot of times I just go to ISO 400 to start. It's not uncommon for me to bump up to ISO 800 if the situation warrants it, and even all the way up to 1250 if I need to, because modern day cameras are just really good at the higher ISOs. It's not quite as bad as it used to be where you really needed to stay 400 or lower to get some clean images. These days, modern day sensors, they're just really powerful and you don't get that much noise. And basically, at the end of the day, a little noise in your photo is better than a blurry photo. So don't feel like you're stuck at ISO 100 and be afraid to raise it. Bring it up a bit. Now again, similar to shutter speed, play with your ISO in the backyard. See where your camera is strongest at. Mine does pretty good at ISO 400, and I'm pretty comfortable shooting up to ISO 1250, 1600 if need be. But you just sort of got to play with your camera and see where it's at. But in order to be successful at handheld landscape photography, don't be afraid to raise that ISO. It'll help you hit the shutter speed you need to avoid the camera shake and give you a better handheld landscape photography experience. So tip number 3 is if your lens or camera body has image stabilization or vibration reduction, different camera makers call it different things. Nikon tends to call it VR, vibration reduction. This is a technology that can exist in the lens or in the camera body, And essentially it is a series of gyro that use software to sense movement in the camera and then make subtle adjustments to either lens elements or the camera sensor to counteract that movement. So a lot of times these are measured in stops, and essentially something's 5 stops. So for example, the Z7 II has 5 stops of VR image stabilization in it, meaning that I can shoot scenes as if I have 5 stops more light, which lets me shoot in low light a little bit easier. It sort of bends that shutter speed rule by letting you shoot at slower shutter speeds. Now, you got to sort of keep all of this in mind. You got to learn what works for you. Some people, it's similar to the shutter speed thing where I suggest going out in the backyard and practicing. Do the same. Turn on your image stabilization and see how much it helps. There's people more stable than me that can really push their camera with the image stabilization and photograph waterfalls with longer shutter exposures. Again, I drink a little bit too much coffee for that to work, but it does help me shoot a slightly slower shutter speed than my tip 1 guideline. So if you have image stabilization either on the lens or in the camera body, be sure to use it because it'll really help you when you get to your handheld photography. It makes a tremendous difference. Now, I'm actually going to do a video on the vibration reduction capabilities in the Nikon camera, so keep an eye out for that. And I'll demonstrate what using VR enabled on this camera makes it look like through the viewfinder and what it looks like without, and you can see how big of a difference it makes. But point being, if you're doing a lot of handheld landscape photography, if you have image stabilization or VR capability in your lens or camera body, be sure to enable it because it'll help you get a more stable handheld image. Okay, tip number 4 is use just proper hand-holding techniques, as in how you hold the camera, how you brace your body. So for example, you don't want to, typically, I don't recommend holding your camera out here like this to do handheld photography. While I use the back LCD all the time when I'm on a tripod, because the camera's nice and stable and I find it nice and easy to be able to compose, when I'm doing handheld, I really sort of like to, I might frame up a composition, but when I'm going to shoot, I use the viewfinder for a couple of reasons. One, lets me bring my arms, elbows in, tuck, nice solid base. My arms out here, they move, they flex. Bring them back here, nice and firm, nice and close, and I help build a solid base. 2, bring camera up to the eye like this. It actually gives me something to brace the camera against, gives me my arms to center it on, and then I can brace it sort of against my face, my eye, because I can bring it in, keep it nice and close, and I can sort of maximize the chances of me keeping the camera stable. So you want to do that. Other things, let's, I'll walk down here so you can see this, your stance. If you stand like this, you can move, especially if it's windy out, you're on a ridge or something like that. Get your legs braced so you feel like you could have someone run into you, bump into you, and not move. Make sure your feet are planted. Get them nice, solid. Again, bring it up, bring it in close. Keep it like this. Make that base as solid as you possibly can. That'll go a long way to help maximize your chances of getting nice, sharp, crisp images. Don't underestimate the importance of good hand-holding technique, as in how you hold the camera. It's very important. If you've noticed, so many of these tips deal with keeping the camera still. As landscape photographers, we're so used to being on the tripod, nice stable surface, that we forget that's one of the key elements of our image is keeping things nice and still. So from shutter speed to the ISO in order to keep that shutter speed up, to the image stabilization, the VR, also helping stabilize the camera. Use your body, use it as a tripod. If you have the opportunity to do so, you can set your camera on some object. Maybe it's a rock, maybe you can balance on the rock. Maybe that's the wrong camera level, but maybe you can get balanced in on a rock or a log or something like that. Take advantage of any little thing you can do to stabilize your body to give your camera that stable platform. So don't underestimate that. Be sure to use good hand-holding technique. Okay, tip number 5. Use burst mode on your camera. A lot of landscape photographers, me included, when I'm shooting from a tripod, I'm single shot. I press the shutter, I get my one shot, and that's it. However, when you're hand holding, one of the things that can introduce movement is just literally you pressing your button. So pressing it down, that can introduce a little bit of camera shake. But if you use burst mode, you can get your shot lined up, hold the button down, and you get continuous shots. So you sort of get that movement out of the way with the first shutter click, and you maximize your chances you're gonna have one of those images that's a little more still. Now this is sort of a edge case scenario. You know, if you're practicing all the other things, you can probably get pretty decent handheld shots without the burst mode. But if you want to maximize your chances to get a good shot, you're minimizing the chance of camera movement, which is what's going to introduce the blur into your photo. So if you use burst mode, it can just be a little bit of a way. Now you've got more photos to check when you get home, because obviously you're taking a rapid fire series of the same thing, but you sort of maximize your chances that you're going to be perfectly still for one of those and get that nice, crisp, sharp image. So don't underestimate putting your camera in burst mode when you're doing handheld landscape photography so that you get those sharp images. So that's it. Those are my 5 tips for good handheld landscape photography habits. Hopefully that'll help you. Like I said, a lot of this is around trying to keep that camera as stable as possible and maximizing your camera settings, how you hold the camera, and technology to sort of increase your chances of having a stable platform to work from to get those sharp images. So like I said, I think handheld photography is very valuable. I think it's worth taking the time to master, because even for someone like me who probably shoots from a tripod 3/4 to 80% of the time, 85% of the time, I do a lot of handheld with my second camera body when I'm out and about. I do a lot of handheld when I'm in a feature-rich environment, and I want those photos to come out sharp. So I think it's worth taking the time to practice it. Head out into your local metro park like I did today and just practice. The stakes aren't high, and you can learn these things about where you should be, which guidelines should you be doing. Should you be 1 times your focal length, 1.5, 2 times? How much does image stabilization on or off help your photography? And then also just purely practicing how to hold the camera. So all of those things help maximize your success at handheld landscape photography. So how about you? How much hand holding do you do? Do you find yourself shooting from a tripod all the time? Do you hand hold some of the time? Do you do sort of like I do, have 1 camera on a tripod, use a second camera to go capture additional images? Or do you just not like a tripod because it's something else to carry and you find it confining and restricting your landscape photography? Do you have any additional tips for success for hand holding landscape photography? I'd love to hear your comments down below, so feel free, let me know. Are you hand holding a lot? Do you have some tips I missed? What's working for you? What isn't working for you? What do you think? Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.